One of the themes of what I was going to talk about today is about culture and culture of organizations and cultures of change. But just thinking about cultures, it's interesting that an audience in Brazil talks about getting something from Amazon. You're talking about a website, not your famous river system. Good afternoon. My name is Rod Allen, and I'm a Superintendent of Learning with the British Columbia Provincial Government. I've been with the government about 5 years, but I don't have a tattoo yet, so I'm not really quite a government person yet. I come from the field, so I've been a teacher for about 15 years, a vice principal, a principal, and a superintendent of a school district. And so one of the reasons I think, and it was one of the comments out here about people in government, is it a meritocracy, how people get there or not? I sometimes wonder. But I was brought in because of my field experience to be able to talk as an educator, as a professional educator, not just as a public servant. So I'm going to give you a little bit of context from British Columbia, and hopefully can answer and address some of your questions and concerns. It's only 30 minutes, so you had some very big questions, but hopefully we'll get to that also in the conversation. So to begin with, in British Columbia, we noticed that the kinds of experiences that our classroom teachers were trying to provide for their students were already changed from when I went to school. The experiences in the classroom had already started to change. And yet our system, our bureaucracy, had not changed. It was the same as it had been for the last 150 years. And it was the inability of policy and the inability of the structure to keep pace with the changes in the classroom, changes in pedagogy, teachers trying to provide relevant learning experiences to their children. So this wasn't something in British Columbia that was government's idea. It was government's response. And I think that's really, really important. Because often when things are government's idea, they're viewed very skeptically. But when it's government actually trying to come and help, and I know that's a difficult notion sometimes for those of us in government who are here to help, it changed the flavor of that. It changed the nuance of the conversation in British Columbia. We know that our children live in a personalized world. They have smartphones or have access to smartphones, have friends that have smartphones. So do we. This is a very cosmopolitan city. There's access to technology everywhere. And yet my children, I have a 24-year-old son and a 22-year-old daughter, they would never use the term personalized, because to them that's just how it is. It's always been that way. They can't imagine a world that wasn't. They know that access through this changed everything for them. Well, it changed it for us. It didn't change it for them. They've always had access to this. It's got a mind of its own. It's changed everything. So how do we recognize that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. And yet in our classrooms, very often they're more like this, that when we've thought about introducing technology, it's been the teachers who've had access to the technology, not the students. And we know from Code Academy's examples this morning, from Zach, the power of putting that learning right into kids' hands is so, so important. And yet we know that we can't put it in children's hands without also having it in teachers' hands. It's about getting the right balance and the right order. And I think that's something that systems and governments and policymakers need to think very hard about. Michael said it this morning, and we talked at lunch about an incredibly important idea from this morning, is that none of this is about technology. I know we're all here at a technology conference, but technology, this isn't about technology, it's about learning. Technology can support and enable learning, but if technology gets out front, we're all in trouble. Policymakers often chase shiny things. We like putting a tablet in everybody's hand, or a laptop, in sets of laptops in schools, without thinking about the classroom into which those are going, or the learning environment to which those are going. So we have to always keep our mind on learning, not on technology. But many of our schools are still like this. When students come in, they're told to turn off all their access and listen to the teacher. And yet we know that's not how we learn. And it's not how we as adults learn. We like access all the time. Why would we turn it off? It's working now. So with technology in kids' hands, are we going to use it to do things differently? Or just to do more of the same that we've always done? And I think very often we use technology to do things. So are we going to use it are our kids going to ask better questions? And yet, are our kids going to ask better questions than they've asked before? Is technology going to empower them as learners or get in the way of them as learners? And yet our system doesn't look like a smartphone. Our system, our structures, our government policies still look like a rotary phone. We still talk about putting kids in classrooms. We talked about this morning. In fact, the prevailing conversation this morning still was about kids in groups of about 25 sitting in a room with a teacher. That's a very difficult mindset to get past. And yet technology can take us to some different models, can allow some things to change. We have to get out of the business of grouping kids according to their date of manufacture, how old they are. That leads to, as I think it was Michael talked about, the notion of social passes. We had to make decisions and choices in the past that cool, more technology. The OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, talks about this for learning environments. This is a list we've paid a lot of attention to in British Columbia. It says they need to be learner-centered and structured and well-designed, profoundly personalized, inclusive and social. Across British Columbia, we've used this list for the last number of years, and not one person has disagreed with anything on this list. No one has said, actually, I don't think we want our learning environments to be learner-centered. And yet the question for us is, do our policies get us closer to this or drive us away from this? Do they enable this or get in the way of this? And unfortunately, the answer has been, it gets in the way. Our policy framework, our structure, and certainly our educational culture doesn't help us get here. And yet we have many, many teachers trying to get here. But they do that by closing their door and not sharing their practice because they're breaking lots of rules. So we began our journey in British Columbia in looking at this list. And this is what's in our policy, in our legal document. This is the purpose of the education system legally in British Columbia, is to produce students like this. We've had that list in our School Act since 1988. We asked a group of business leaders, college leaders, and people from the social and arts communities to look at this list and tell us if they wanted anything changed. And they said, no, that's a great list, don't bother changing it. But you need to do it, because you've ignored this since 1988. And that was a powerful message to our politicians to say, here's some license to go and do some of this. And we really needed that permission. So again, this is a list that does need to be updated a little bit, but it's close enough for now. The question is, does our exam-based system get us closer to this? Does the way our curriculum's currently written help us get here or get in the way? Just to be provocative, a slide or two from Yang Zhao, who wrote the book World Class Learners. And he talks about the sausage maker theory of education. And he challenges us with this idea that secondary schools are fine if you like sausage. Because the goal is to have all the kids come out the same. So you take all those individual personalities, skills, abilities, passions that come in our door, and you grind out sausage. And you get this very narrow set of employability or employability skills. Now that might have worked 50 years ago when we had a narrow set of expectations for our graduates. They were many going to work in factories. That's why we have bells in schools and kids move around like in a factory model. But that's not our world anymore. So we need a much greater range of employability skills for our young people. So he asks the question, can we reverse that? Can we take all those individual differences, cultural diversity, the curiosity and the passion and the creativity, and actually enhance it? What a crazy notion. Can the school experience enhance those things for each child rather than minimize them? What this means, though, is that not every child's coming out the same. And we have to be okay with that. And the truth of the matter is, and you know it and I know it, they're already not coming out the same. They all come out different anyway. So let's recognize that, and let's have a system that focuses more on enhancing those abilities and passions and interests, not minimizing them. So the question we've asked in British Columbia starting about 2.5 years ago was this one. If we know those things to be true, that we know about the learning sciences, we know how kids learn, we know how they don't learn, we know the kinds of learning environments they need to be in, we know the kinds of skills and abilities that those children need to be active members of society. And that's a much wider range of things than just a good math score, although that's still important. They have to be able to use it and apply it in meaningful ways. If we know those things to be true, why do we keep doing what we're doing? And we found we couldn't answer that question with anything other than we need to change. So we keep this question front and center in government, and we keep this question front and center throughout our entire education system. When will what we know change what we do? To keep doing what we're doing is malpractice. So the role of technology. How does technology fit into this? All too often, we take technology and just try to do things better than we've done before, not different. And if that's all it was, we just get bigger slide rules. And if you're old like me and you remember what a slide rule was, if you're young like you don't remember what a slide rule was. But it's not about doing bad things faster. It's about doing things differently, putting learning into the hands of kids. The power of the internet, the power of online resources, the power of communication can really change things. So it's not about using technology to do the same old things we've always done. It's using technology to do things better. That's why we have to stay focused on learning, not technology. But technology enables all this stuff that we're talking about. We have another saying in British Columbia that's another way of saying this, which is culture eats policy for breakfast. Culture eats policy for breakfast. You can have the best policy in the world, and if your culture doesn't support it, you're doomed. You could have the best curriculum in the world. If the culture of the system doesn't embrace it, know how to use it, and adopt it in the right ways, it's meaningless. So how is it that we think about culture? Has been a key question to us in British Columbia. It's been a key question to government in British Columbia, how we think about changing the learning culture. The educated citizen slide that I showed you, here's our 3 pillars that we're focusing on in British Columbia right now. Literacy and numeracy foundations. We have to make sure that every one of our children can read and write and be numerate at a high level. The first part of 21st century learning for us is 18th century learning. Reading, writing, numeracy. That doesn't mean you can't do it in innovative ways, but those things haven't changed. Secondly, an understanding and applying of rich content. British Columbia has always been seen to have a good curriculum. We actually sell it around the world. People buy our curriculum. People like it. It's good stuff. What's been missing, though, is the understanding and applying. We've had lots of good content, but there's been no space to do anything with it. So we still have prescribed learning outcomes. We still have learning standards. Every child has to meet them. And I'll come back to those in a minute. And we have these core competencies. That's different for us. We're now explicitly stating in the curriculum these broad areas of thinking, communication, and personal and social development are required learning for every child. You need space to do that with, and again, we'll come back to that. If there was, we were talking at lunch about elevator speeches and how we hate them. If there was one line, though, I think that we use to describe what we're trying to do in British Columbia, it's this. There's a big difference between knowing something and understanding it. Our curriculum has been based, and I suggest yours, and I suggest the vast majority of the world's curriculum has been based on knowing. Memorize these things. Here's the list of things that are important to know. Memorize this list, put it on a test, check it off. There's very little space left for students to learn to understand it and to apply it and to really use it in innovative ways. Andreas Schleicher from the OECD is quoted as saying, "It used to be that mattered was what you knew, but what matters now is what you do with what you know." How do you find time and space for the doing? So this is our new curriculum. Our old was about this thick, and binders about this thick for every grade. Hundreds of learning outcomes for every subject. This is now what it looks like, one single digital page. So we've greatly reduced some things. You'll notice there at the bottom, there's still learning standards. And it's too small for you to see, but if you go online, and I'll give you the URL at the end, you can see all this online. You can have full access to it. Concepts and content, what students need to know. There used to be about, on this list, there used to be about 40 or 50 things per grade, per subject. Now there's about 10. But they're bigger ideas. Up above that, you see big ideas. That's the understanding part. Are there 3 or 4 or 5 big ideas, excuse me, that we need kids to come to understand? Not just know, but understand. And they can only understand it, we believe, through hands-on, project-based learning kinds of experiences. In order to find time for that, teacher said, you have to get rid of some of this trivial pursuit. You've got to get rid of some of this crazy stuff to make space for the big stuff. Up above that, you see core competencies, the triangles. And again, this is online. You can click on those and you can see them expanded. But this is where we're saying thinking, communication, and personal and social development are mandatorily taught for all children. All children have to come to learn those things. Can you teach a course on collaboration? No. Can you find out if students have learned those skills through a test? No. You have to provide experiences for them. And that takes time. That takes different kinds of classroom experiences. That changes the role of the teacher. Because kids have to get their hands dirty. They have to work together. They can't just do what we're doing, you sitting there sleeping and me up here talking. It needs to be reversed. In our school system, at the end of the day, the joke is, at the end of the day, the teachers go home exhausted and the kids are all excited. We need to change that. So we're excited with this. One of the big differences as a policymaker about this is, while this is a government document, this is government policy, government did not write it. Our teachers wrote it. So we did this through a co-construction process with our educators in our schools. And they wrote it publicly. And they argued publicly about, should this be in, should this be in? How do we balance these two things? All those were very public debates. So that when this curriculum hit the press, the first place the press went to was our teachers' union, who was very strong, and said, tell us how much you hate this, because it comes from government. And our teacher said, we love this because we wrote it. And so it's starting to build a new relationship between our ministry and our educators, because now we're in a collaborative process. We are doing this together. And that co-construction piece has been really, really important. It's starting to change everything. It's changing how we see ourselves interacting. We know that we have to change our assessments. We're, again, engaged in a collaborative process with our universities, because our kids, when they graduate, have to go to university. And the admissions process into university has to change too. So we're having that conversation with our universities about assessment programs. Because if they don't like it, this won't work. So again, another co-constructed process, how we rethink our assessment practices. We're rethinking about how we communicate to parents about how their children are doing. Because we know we have done a bad job of that historically. Parents don't feel connected to their child's learning. The conversation in my household as a parent over dinner table with my children was, how was school today? Fine. What did you learn? Nothing. That's it. I have no other questions. But we're finding where parents have greater access to the ongoing learning process of their kids, they have learning conversations. So this is just one example. Again, this isn't about technology, it's about learning. But what this teacher's done in a very simple way is they put a QR code on the report card. Parents zap that with their smartphone, and that takes them straight into the child's electronic portfolio. They can see live examples of video clips of their child in class, doing presentations, samples of their work. That changes the conversation at home, at the dinner table. Now it's about learning, because the parent has an entry into that conversation. I saw that a little snip of your presentation that you did today in social studies. That's really interesting. Why did you do this over that? Or did you know that your Uncle Bob was a pilot, and whatever it might be. All of a sudden, parents and students are having learning conversations. That impacts on children's learning. It's not about technology, but technology enables really good practice. So one of the cultural shifts we've tried to do in British Columbia can be maybe captured in this. And I never thought I'd use an Ayn Rand quote, but strange bedfellows. But it's that cultural piece that I talked about earlier. Culture eating policy for breakfast. And the revolution doesn't happen with new tools, it happens with new behaviors. So what we're seeing developing in British Columbia is a spirit more like this. For example, we used a process a year ago called innovation. Well, what did we call it? Innovation through, it was sort of a dumb rules piece, where we invited educators from around the province to, if they found a rule or a regulation from government that got in the way of them trying to do something for kids, we asked them to tell us what that rule was and why they wanted to break it. And then we'd see if we could give them a get-out-of-jail-free card. We don't put teachers in jail, but you know what I mean. A free pass. And it started an entrepreneurial spirit of teachers looking at regulations and us thinking differently about those rules. Interestingly, what we found was exactly what was found in England when they did this earlier, was that 75 or 80% of those things that teachers asked permission to do, they could already do under the current policy framework. They just needed to think a bit more innovatively. But it engaged us in a conversation about policy in the right way. And it's about how do we get good learning out of this? Not how does this policy stop good learning, but how do we make sure that we maximize the learning opportunities out of policy? So it got us to this state of groups of teachers working in networks across British Columbia with this kind of an entrepreneurial spirit. It's not about who's going to let me. The question is who's going to stop me. So for government, that can be frightening sometimes. As an educator, that's very exciting. That sense of we can change this together. And so this transformation in British Columbia, and we have a long way to go. We're just in early stages. But already it's being seen positively by our teachers union, our parents, and our post-secondary partners, which puts government in an interesting position. Because guess what? All those people vote. And so for us, a really important idea is social license. Governments, just because they're elected, maybe don't have the right to do whatever they want anymore. Maybe they did 50 years ago. But now it's about social license. How is it we make sure that we are always explaining what we're doing, both to the parents and the students and the teachers, as well as to the politicians, so that there's no surprises here. Everybody knows what we're doing. And that's different kind of work for people like me than we've done before. It changes things a lot. But it puts the power, it reduces the likelihood that a change in government would lead to a change in policy. Because the people are speaking loudly and clearly across the province that they want something like this transformed system. So even though we don't know exactly where we're going yet, we know the direction that we're heading. We have everybody on side, or almost everybody on side, and we're working cautiously moving forward. Too cautiously for some of us, but moving forward. It changes the relationship between government and the electorate and education. We try to depoliticize education. And lastly, I've been asked by 4 ministers that I've worked for, 4 different ministers of education, and they've all asked me the same question, which is, when will we be done? Will we be done in 2 years? Will we be done in 3 years? And we know that cultural change takes a really, really long time. So this is the answer I've been using. We'll be done when the children are leaving our schools as curious as when they arrive, because they come pre-wired like this. We just do something that beats that out of them over the next 12 or 13 years. So we want the eyes of our graduating students to still have that curiosity and wonder that our kindergarten students have. Thank you very much.